Good afternoon, everybody, for this afternoon session. We've got here now our 11th working session this afternoon with three distinguished speakers, with Matej Medvedecki from Slovakia, Davide Borsani and Gianluca Pastori both from Italy. Before we start, the house rules as you know them: 20 minutes to speak. 5 minutes before I hand out a warning order. And for the audience, please turn your mobile phones to silent. It might be possible that you're deep into finance business and you get an important telephone call. If this is the case, please, I would like to ask you to leave the room to handle your financial details. Okay, good. The first speaker today is Matej Medvedecki from Slovakia. Matej Medvedecki received his PhD in 1977, so quite a long time ago. I was only...
This is my born day.
Oh, your birthday, sorry. It was... Okay, good. Sorry for that. Here my finger says. Okay, so you're younger than me. Interesting. He works as a senior... Sorry for that.
No problem.
So he works as a senior researcher at the Department of Military History Research of the Institute for Military History in Bratislava. His studies mainly focus on modern military history, the Security Intelligence Agency in Czechoslovakia in the 20th century, and the repressive bodies of totalitarian regimes and extremism. He's a member of the scientific board of the Institute for Military History and a member of the editorial board of the magazine Vojenská Historia, which is published in Bratislava, and of the editorial board of the magazine. So a highly acclaimed, highly accomplished researcher from Slovakia. And he will talk about the liberation of 1919 of Slovakia. So very often we in Western Europe, we think the war in 1918 was over. Perhaps we think a bit of the Russian Civil War. But I think in the last years, it has come back to our conscience that the Great War didn't end in Eastern Europe in 1918, but there were a number of successor wars. And I'm very happy to listen now to Matej Medvedecki's presentation.
Dear Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. Okay. Just to know how it works. Well, just to give you a general impression, for approximately 1,000 years, Slovakia was an important part of the multinational Hungarian kingdom. The rise of nationalism at the end of the 18th century, and especially in the late 19th century, had a very specific form in the Hungarian kingdom. Hungarian ruling elite was quite obsessed with chauvinism and launched a large-scale Magyarization project or program with the intention to transform Hungary into a single-nation country. Before this long-term program could be accomplished, the Central Powers were defeated in the World War II and the Habsburg monarchy ceased to exist. At the end of the World War I, on the ruins of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Czechoslovakia emerged as one of the new countries. Czechs and Slovak soldiers who served in the legions in Russia, Italy, France provided the country very strong support and provided very strong support to its right to exist. Though, until summer 1919, Czechoslovak armed forces were formed under very complicated conditions. The borders of the country were not finally set, and were not guaranteed by the powers. At the same time, the severe post-war situation did not allow Czechoslovak authorities to invest sufficient effort into planning and organization of the army. But finally, after Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk was elected as a president and the new government of Karel Kramář was appointed, the Ministry of National Defense was established in the half of November 1980. It has to deal with difficult objectives, especially of securing the authority of Czechoslovak state on all its territory and securing its border. At the same time, vast majority of Czechoslovak soldiers were still abroad. Our armed forces consisted at that time of the legions with more than 100,000 men in France, Italy and Russia, as well as 55 home defense battalions with another 57,000 men formed from Czechs and Slovak, former Austro-Hungarian soldiers and Poles and prisoners of war. The military administration, therefore, very quickly started to build up regular military units at home while organizing the improvised volunteer units. At the time, we had many border tensions. And at the same time, the liberation of Slovakia, that was at the end of the year 1918, still under the control of Hungarian authorities, could be started, and it had four phases and was not without dramatic turnarounds. Well, the whole action started very spontaneously. Soldiers of the supplementary battalion of the 25th Home Defense Regiment under the command of First Lieutenant Alois Rybka, and this unit consisted of one officer and 120 soldiers, liberated on 1st November 1918 the border city Holič, and one day next a village Kbely that is very close to Holič, and on the November 4th, 1980, they liberated the city of Malacky. 2 days later, Slovak provisional government headed by Dr. Vavro Šrobar arrived to Skalica, another town on the borders, meaning Czechoslovak borders. At this moment, an accompanying group of Czech gendarmeries, together with Slovaks serving in the regiment of Lučenec, took the active role in the liberation process, and on November the 7th they liberated Trnava, just to be forced out by the Hungarian counterattack after 6 days. On 10th of November, the headquarters of Czechoslovak armies in Slovakia was established, and it was seated in the city Uherské Hradiště, and since the 16th of December 1918 in the city of Žilina in northern Slovakia. General Josef Štika was appointed as commander, and later he was replaced by Colonel František Schöbel. Schöbel divided units under his command into two groups, one the so-called Holič, and second so-called Trenčín. Holič is on the southwestern part of Slovakia, and Trenčín is in the middle, so they could just start liberating the country. During the first days of December 1918, with regard to the expected arrival of Czechoslovak Army Legion Corps from Italy, that were to be responsible for securing the demarcation line between Hungary and Slovakia, both military groups were tasked by the commander of the Czechoslovak Army in Prague, an organizer of Czechoslovak volunteer units, Field Untermarschall Jan Diviš, to advance to Nitra in west central Slovakia and take action towards Žilina, an important city in the northern Slovakia. Very soon, our military unit secured the line of Western Slovakia from Devinské jazero near Bratislava through Pezinok, Sereď, Nitra, Žilina, and Čadca, the city Čadca in the north. And at that time, also a ministry with the full authority to administer Slovakia was established in Žilina with Dr. Vavor Šrobar, whom I already mentioned, as a minister. The first military group of the Home Army under Colonel Hrbenský, which included Slovak volunteer guards of Slovak Freedom, commanded by Captain Ludovic Šimko, managed by 20th December 1918 to seize without facing any stronger Hungarian resistant upper parts of the territory by the river Váh and part of the Spiš county. At the same time, other Czechoslovak troops liberated Kremnica from Banská Bystrica, Zvolen, and other important city. And by the end of December, Czechoslovak troops reached eastern Slovakia cities of Prešov and Košice. For these events, soldiers of the Czechoslovak Army Legion Corps from Italy were responsible. On 25th December 1918, its commander, Division General Luigi Giuseppe Piccione, took the command over all military operations in Slovakia. Regiments of the 7th Legion, under the command of General Boriani, liberated Bratislava on 2nd January 1919, and during the night, following night from 2nd to 3rd January, also Lučenec in the south Slovakia, Nové Zámky, that is currently very close to the border with Hungary, and the border city of Komárno. The regiments of the 6th Legion under the command of General Rossi by 15th January 1919 succeeded to occupy the demarcation line, the set demarcation line between Hungary and Slovakia in the eastern part of the country. The whole Home Army liberated whole inland of Slovakia by January the 20th, 1919, without facing any serious difficulties. In the footsteps of Czechoslovak soldiers, the new Czechoslovak administration started to take over the control of the country. But the situation was about to change, as on the 16th of February 1919, the Supreme War Council on a Paris Peace Conference set a second demarcation line between Slovakia and Hungary that went further south to the Hungarian territory, I mean today's Hungarian territory. It led from the mouth of the river Ipel through highest peak of Novigrad, highlands, Bukové, Vrchy hills, to the south, Miskolc, through Šaroš-Paták to Perečín and River Úh. This demarcation line reflected the geopolitical and military consideration of Czechoslovak delegation in Paris. Hungarian government was informed on 20th March 1919 by Colonel Ferdinand Vix. This was the final blow to the effort of Hungarian politicians to keep the territorial integrity of the old Hungarian kingdom. Shortly after, Hungarian Republic of Council was established, led by a communist government chaired by Béla Kun. Hungarian communists, expecting to receive strong support and help from Soviet Russia, as well as from the proletariat of the neighboring countries, focused on spreading the revolution by the power of arms. They formed a new Red Army and refused to accept the note of Colonel Vix. And as a result, in the middle of April 1990, Romanian army started its advance towards the river Tisa. But unfortunately, by the day, Czechoslovak command was not able to finish all its preparations, and therefore the advance towards the second demarcation line was not coordinated with the Romanians. Furthermore, Czechoslovak armed forces were not able to reach the line, as the well-equipped Hungarian Red Army, strengthened by recent mobilization up to 100,000 men, launched on May 22nd, 1990, its counterattack. Attacking forces very soon succeeded in pushing Czechoslovak army out of Šalgotarian and Miskolc and started its advance northwards. Czechoslovak forces had to withdraw back to the original demarcation line, and fights continued then on Slovak territory. At the end of the May, reorganized and well-equipped Hungarian force launched the so-called Northern Campaign. In few days, Czechoslovak forces were forced to withdraw to the line Komárno, Nové Zámky, Nová Baňa, Šťavnica, Tornala. Soon, Hungarians in the first half of June managed to seize the Košice and Prešov, and near Bardejov they even reached the Slovak-Polish border. During the critical moments, Italian commanders were replaced by French and Czechoslovak officers. By decision of the President Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk, you can see there map showing borders of Czechoslovakia. So, I mean the second demarcation line going through today's Hungarian territory. By decision of the President Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk, French General Maurice Pelé was appointed as a commander of the Czechoslovak army. Together with officers and general from the mission at the beginning of June 1990, he took the command over the Czechoslovak army engaged in fights against the Hungarian Bolsheviks. General Pelé started with reorganization of the army with the aim to stop the advance of the enemy. He regrouped his forces and launched a counter-offensive. He ordered organization of the reserve units in the western part of the country, ordered to form new units that were to be transported from Bohemia and Moravia to Slovakia. He also divided the front into two territories, one under command of General Hancock, and the second one, the western one, under the command of General Mittelhäuser. Hancock's group consisted of two sections, one in Košice, manned by the 6th Division, and Subcarpathian section manned by the 3rd Division, and the Western Territory Army Group consisted of the Danube section, the 7th Division, and Ypres section manned by the 2nd Division. At the same time, General Pelé asked Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch for immediate supplies of military material, especially heavy artillery, ammunition, and airplanes. Soon, two complete air units with reconnaissance and fighters and bombers arrived from France, and they were soon followed by freight trains carrying big caliber guns and large amount of ammunition. Further measures of the French command included establishment of military tribunals, tightening of the discipline at the military unit, and in accordance with the state authorities, they declared martial law in Slovakia. At the same time, production of ammunition, factories was changed into the war production. Very soon, Czechoslovak units under the French command started a counter-offensive, quite successful, as at the beginning of June, they launched attack from Komárno and Nitra, and soon recaptured Nové Zámky, the city in the south, Banská Štiavnica, and the city Levice that was considered as strategically important for both sides. At the same time, Hungarians tried to make a counter-offensive towards Bratislava, but it failed. And finally, by the decision of a peace conference in France, the fights were stopped. In total, the Czechoslovak-Hungarian peace talks started at the end of June, at 25th June, in Reduta building in Bratislava, and it resulted in an armistice signed on 1st July, and then Hungarian forces started to withdraw from Slovakia. In total, Czechoslovakia lost 1,000 men, and some 3,700 were wounded. Estimated Hungarian losses were quite similar, 1,000 to 1,500 killed in action and some 3,600 wounded. What is important also for me is that the 1919 experience of war with Hungary and the liberation of Slovakia left the Czechoslovak military planners to, with the necessity, and together with the quite aggressive foreign policy of Hungary and their support for irredentism in southern Slovakia, left the Czechoslovak military planners with the only option to plan a future war or to be prepared for a future war. So, especially what were Czechoslovak military planners afraid was the two-front war with Germany as one front line and Hungary as a second front line. This was an option that Czechoslovak army was preparing all the 20s and 1930s. Though the two-front war never materialized, Czechoslovakia had to cede great amount of Slovak territory to Hungary after the Vienna Award in 1938, and some other territories after the surprising Hungarian attacks on Slovakia in March 1939. What is interesting that during the Second World War, both Slovakia and Hungary were German allies. Nevertheless, both countries made steps to be prepared for future military confrontation, meaning, for example, that both countries did not equip their most modern military equipment of German origin to the Eastern Front, but both kept their best vehicles at home just in case for possible arson territories in the future. And at the end, I would like to point that after the Second World War, of course, this changed because we have a new political paradigm, and both countries were more like preparing for the attack or defense from the West. But nevertheless, after the fall of the communist regime in 1989, Czechoslovak military planners still calculated with the possibility of a Soviet attack that would not lead only through Czechoslovak-Soviet border, but also through Hungary. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matej. This was in time perfect. Thank you very much for this interesting and insightful paper. The next speaker will be Dr. Davide Borsani. Davide Borsani is an Associate Research Fellow at the ISPI and a post-PhD Research Fellow at the Catholic University of Milan. He is an expert on the Atlantic community and about NATO, and he also teaches and researches on American grand strategy and US-UK relationship. And I'm very proud that in his paper here I can understand the Italian title, La Special Relationship Anglo-Americana e la Guerra della Falkland. I'm very proud of my Italian language skills. Good. Davide, you will talk about the Adriatic question at the Paris conference, the Royal Italian Navy and the birth of the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. I was in Zadar last week, and once you've been to Zadar, this Croatian town, you will see that many buildings are from the interwar years, and you feel more or less like in an Italian town. And I'm very anxious to listen now to your paper. Please, the floor is yours, Davide.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, the Adriatic Sea has historically involved the Royal Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, as an instrument of Italy's foreign policy. The access from the south through the Strait of Otranto and the eastern shore, the Dalmatian coast, have traditionally played an essential role in the Italian strategy. A study entitled Comparison Between the Italian Fleet and the Austrian Fleet, conducted by the Regia Marina in 1904, emphasized the unfavorable geostrategic situation of Italy. Accordingly, the enemy, Austria-Hungary, in fact a controversial ally in the Triple Alliance, would operate from a rocky coast stretching from Pola to Ragusa. There, a direct landing would have been practically impossible for the Italian Navy. The Austrian fleet had its strategic strength in the naval bases of Pola and Cattaro, and several islands and good ports, including Trieste, Zara, Sebenico, and Spalato. In Istria, the naval base of Pola was protected by the fortified islands of Lucin, thus being easily defensible. The same went in the south, in the Montenegrin area at Cattaro, which was in excellent position to control the southern Adriatic. On the other hand, the Italian situation was less favorable, being conditioned by two opposing factors. First, the insufficiency of the naval bases in terms of number and location. Second, the many coastal targets were exposed to enemy's offensive. If we add that a war could be fought simultaneously in the Tyrrhenian and the Adriatic seas because of the geographical position, these factors forced the Italian Royal Navy to make Taranto the strategic pivot of its maritime strategy. From there, the fleet could be more easily deployed in the west or in the east. The signing of the Treaty of London in April 1915 represented a milestone for Italy, opening the doors to intervention into the Great War. It started a very peculiar phase of its foreign policy, lasting about a decade. Throughout these years, Rome played its international role alongside the allies of Great Britain and, despite some ups and downs, France. Italy remained substantially loyal to this alliance for its duration, even in the first half of Mussolini's ventennio, 2 decades. The French and British played a relevant role in negotiating the thorny Adriatic question at the peace conference. Nevertheless, Italy had to take into account another significant player, the United States, not as an ally, but as an associated power that didn't sign the Treaty of London. On the contrary, Washington disavowed the agreement. The Treaty of London regulated the modalities of Italian entry into the war, listing several clauses defining the territorial acquisitions by Rome in the event of victory. In the north, in Trentino, the agreement granted Italy its natural geographical border. In the east, the entire region of Istria and half Dalmatia would be assigned to Italy, including the main islands in front of the coast. The shores from Cape Planca to the Sabbioncello Peninsula and between Ragusa and Cattaro and those islands not assigned to Italy would also be neutralized. The following Adriatic territories would be given to Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro. In the northern Adriatic, the entire coast from Istria to the northern border of Dalmatia, and the whole shore of Croatia, with the port of Rijeka, in Italian Fiume. In the southern Adriatic, the entire coast from Cape Planca to the Drina River, with the critical ports of Spalato, Ragusa, Cattaro. In Albania, Italy would receive full sovereignty over Valona, the island of Saseno, and surrounding territory to ensure the defense of this area. For the Italian government, led by the Prime Minister Antonio Salandra, the abandonment of the city of Fiume, populated by Italians, was a sacrifice. Still, it was done to achieve total military dominance in the Adriatic Sea. Not a secondary aspect, the Treaty of London didn't consider the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, keeping it as the main threat to Italy. A firm supporter of the treaty was the Chief of Staff of the Royal Italian Navy, Admiral Paolo Taon di Revel. After the victory, in his view, the complete application of the agreement was necessary because Italy had entered the war above all to ensure domination of the Adriatic. The coast of Romagna and Puglia, he maintained, would be at the enemy's mercy without controlling Dalmatia and its archipelago. This would expose Italy to threats coming from east and west simultaneously, where the French fleet remained a powerful rival. The debate on the self-determination of Fiume didn't interest Count de Revel very much. In his words, and I quote, "If Fiume represents wealth, Dalmatia represents security. Fiume represents the possibility of sumptuously furnishing a house without doors. Dalmatia means keeping a house with inviolable doors, albeit more modestly. Between these two solutions, there can be no doubt about the choice, to hold firm for Dalmatia and, when everything fails, immolate Fiume but save Dalmatia." End of quote. From the perspective of the Italian Navy, an enemy with the shore between Zara and Spalato in its hands, including the military port of Sebenico and its neighboring islands, would regularly have the possibility to exercise sea denial in the whole Adriatic Sea. Under this scenario, the Italian fleet will find itself exposed to a significant naval threat, even if it had the control of the base of Pola. The Great War had shown that this event was a real possibility, since the Italian Navy couldn't conduct a decisive attack against the Austro-Hungarian fleet. On the one hand, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire was a crucial factor in the failure to apply the Treaty of London. In the eyes of the British and the French, Austro-Hungary's disappearance cancelled the main threat to the Italian coasts. However, Italy's view differed a lot. The proclamation of the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and I mean Yugoslavia, was not a factor of stability in the Adriatic Sea. On the contrary, despite being militarily weak, the new state could constitute a strategic danger in the medium or long term, directly or indirectly, at least by providing its bases to Italy's enemies and rivals, to France, for instance. On the other hand, the idealism of the US President Woodrow Wilson represented a further influential element at the diplomatic table of the peace conference. In January 1918, Wilson illustrated his 14-point peace program without being bound to previously signed war treaties. In his view, the principle of nationality and self-determination of peoples represented the foundation of true international justice. The ninth point envisaged a redefinition of the Italian borders along clearly recognizable lines of ethnicity. Even if it granted the northern natural border, in fact mostly populated by non-Italians, it also removed Italy's control of the eastern shore of the Adriatic, populated by Slavs. The 11th point, the only one Wilson submitted to an external observer for a consultation, a Serbian, asked for access to the sea for Serbia, the soon-to-be Yugoslavia. The Paris Peace Conference began in January 1919. Previously, an intense political debate took place in Italy on the need to annex Fiume, even by sacrificing some territorial acquisitions in the Adriatic. At the end of 1918, the Italians living in the city of Fiume asked for annexation through a referendum, and the Italian public opinion supported this measure. Therefore, the Italian government, now led by Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, made the annexation a diplomatic goal. Count de Revel had come to terms with this, accepting a derogation from the complete application of the Treaty of London. In his words, and I quote again, "Of course, I couldn't have opposed the renunciations that proved indispensable for political or territorial military reasons, since this judgment exceeded from my competence." End of quote. Count de Revel would agree on giving up some inner islands, such as Meleda, Lesina, and Curzula, if the control of Fiume was granted from this trade-off. After all, he now believed that Fiume could be quickly transformed into a naval base in the event of war, acquiring a strategic value in the upper Adriatic. As far as Yugoslavia was concerned, if Wilson's plans would be implemented, the mere fact of possessing the eastern Adriatic coast would keep threatening Italian security in Count de Revel's opinion. It was important whether the great powers considered the new kingdom a threat to Italy or not. It didn't even matter that Yugoslavia had no substantial fleet, nor that the winning powers wouldn't allow Belgrade to build one in the future. All these wouldn't give a definitive solution to the naval problem of the Adriatic. Only full Italian dominance of the sea would solve the problem. Great Britain and France, but especially the United States, disagreed with this view. Not only Wilson rejected the Treaty of London, but he also believed that the possession of a single island in front of Dalmatia was more than sufficient then for Italy. As for Fiume, the principle of self-determination had to be applied by considering also the district behind the city itself, consisting of 2/3 of Slavs and 1/3 of Italians. Thus, it should belong to Yugoslavia, not to Italy. In Wilson's view, economy was also important. If Trieste went to Italy, Fiume had to be assigned to Yugoslavia to create trade competitiveness between Rome and Belgrade. In sum, the Yugoslavs were to be granted the eastern coast of Istria, including Fiume, the entire Dalmatian coast and its archipelago. In the earliest weeks of the peace conference, the US position was strengthened by the unilateral recognition of the newborn kingdom. The difference between the American and Italian approaches was striking. The United States intended to deal with Yugoslavia as a liberated state, which didn't participate in the conflict. According to Wilson, the newborn kingdom was not hostile to the new European order, representing a significant pillar of the US project in Eastern Europe. As for Italy, yes, it maintained Serbia as an ally alongside the Entente during the war, being the first country attacked by the Central Empires. But the status of the Croats and Slovenes was far more controversial. Many of them had fought among the ranks of Austro-Hungarian troops against Italian soldiers. Others, however, had lined up alongside the Allies. Once the new kingdom was created by joining Serbians, Croats, and Slovenes, the problem increased in size. The Italian Prime Minister Orlando told Wilson that the unilateral recognition of the new Yugoslav kingdom was not a friendly act towards Italy. At the end of the day, the Italian government considered the Croats and Slovenes as enemies who replaced the Austrians. As for Great Britain and France, the Yugoslav Union made Croatia and Slovenia a part of an enlarged Serbia, a firm ally during the war. According to Wilson, Italian fears were unmotivated, even considering the creation of the League of Nations. The US president couldn't imagine a Yugoslav fleet that could threaten Italy under the League's regime. The only risk would be an alliance formed by Yugoslavia with some other powers which didn't adhere to the League, for instance, Russia and Germany. For this reason, Wilson maintained that the old game of spheres of influence had to disappear in the Balkans. His task was to avoid any foot in the region by any European power, including Italy. For the Italian government, however, the guarantees offered by the League of Nations weren't enough to prevent the new Yugoslav kingdom from threatening Italy. During the negotiations, the Italian Foreign Minister, Sidney Sonnino, told the counterparts that what was happening on the Adriatic question was a crime against the Italian people. Each of these problems had no solution throughout 1919. Neither the withdrawal of the Italian delegation from the peace conference nor the change of government in Rome could solve the Adriatic question. The more weeks passed, the clearer it was that the full application of the Treaty of London and the Italian dominance of the Adriatic were inaccessible prospects. Meanwhile, in Italy, those politicians and military claiming full control of the Adriatic, even by sacrificing Fiume, became weaker and weaker in the face of the prolonged stall in Paris. A significant socio-economic crisis also shifted public opinion's attention from the peace conference to domestic priorities. Town di Revel thus decided to resign as a chief of staff of the enemy, judging the situation unbearable for him. The Adriatic victory in the Great War, as he had conceived, was effectively nullified. Rome and Belgrade finally resolved the Adriatic question at the bilateral level in June 1920, when they signed the Treaty of Rapallo. The agreement granted Italy a favorable border in Istria. Fiume became a free and independent city to be united to Italy by a short strip of territory. Italy was also granted the outer island of Cherso, Lucin, Lagosta, and Pelagosa, not Lissa, and sovereignty over Zara in Dalmatia. All Dalmatia was handed over to the Yugoslavs with the guarantees for the protection of Italian minorities living there. The entire coast of its archipelago, however, were not demilitarized, as the Treaty of London maintained instead. Fiume went under Italian sovereignty 4 years later with the Treaty of Rome, but from that moment on, Italy and Yugoslavia became clear strategic enemies. To conclude, the First World War had significant strategic consequences on Italy. On the one hand, it concluded a crucial phase of Italian history aimed at reaching its natural borders, such as the Northern Barrier in Trentino. Moreover, the traditional enemy, the Habsburg Empire, disappeared. On the other hand, the dissolution of Austria-Hungary caused the failures of Italy's naval aspirations. The position of the new kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes at the peace conference was stronger than Italian government's expectations, hovering between defeated power and winning power, mainly due to US support. The Italian Royal Navy and Taon di Revel himself irremediably lost the Adriatic diplomatic battle waged at the peace conference. The Italian Navy didn't see its sacrifices in the Great War repaid, being deprived of the absolute domination of the Adriatic. On the contrary, the birth of a new Yugoslav kingdom laid the foundations for developing a future antagonistic naval power. Thus, on the one hand, the First World War turned out to be a lost victory for the Regia Marina, as many Italian naval historians still maintain. But, on the other hand, we must consider that the myth of Vittoria Mutilata, mutilated victory, so crucial at the time for the rise of fascism, obscured 3 fundamental facts. First, the Treaty of Rapallo gave Italy a more solid and defensible frontier than in 1914. Second, Italy defeated its traditional Austrian enemy to a much greater extent than what the French did with the Germans. Third, Italy was a winning power with a new international status and the responsibilities alongside Britain and France, at least. And for sure, the lack of credible political leadership was a factor in the failure to grasp all of this after the end of the war in Italy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Davide. Again, 20 minutes or even 18 minutes and a half. I'm very happy with the discipline here. Our last speaker today in this panel is Gianluca Pastori. Gianluca Pastori is an associate professor in history of political and relations between North America and Europe at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences, again from the Catholic University of Milan. He is also a teacher at the Catholic University in Brescia. He has published extensively in Italy and abroad on a wide range of issues regarding history, security politics, history of international relations, US foreign policy, energy politics, and international politics. And he will talk about the Third War of Italian Independence and the influence of the Prussian military model over the Italian army's professional culture and organization. As a German, not as a Prussian, but as a German, I'm very anxious to listen now to your paper, Gianluca, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everybody, for being here. In 1866, the Third War of Italian Independence closed the long process of national unification, the so-called Risorgimento. The conflict led to the acquisition of Veneto and drastically reduce Austria's territorial presence and political influence over Italy. At the same time, the experience of the Third War of Independence seemed to reconfirm some limit of Italian military establishment, limits already emerged during the Second War of Independence 7 years earlier in 1859. From a diplomatic perspective, the Third War of Independence, was carefully prepared. On April 8, 1866, the Italian government, led by General Alfonso Ferrero della Marmora, signed a military alliance with Prussia, an alliance actively promoted by the Prussian Chancellor, Prince Otto von Bismarck. The French Emperor, Napoleon III, looked favorably to the Prussian-Italian entente. In August 1865, the French Foreign Minister, Édouard Drouin de Lhuys, confirmed to the Italian ambassador in Paris, Mr. Costantino Nigra, that the French government, in case of an Austria-Prussian war, and I'm quoting, would have stuck to neutrality and would have not opposed a possible Italian involvement in the conflict, end of quotation. Russia and Britain sported more or less the same attitude, albeit for a different reason. Their shared interest was to weaken Austria's role in Europe, in the European theater, and an interest, of course, that largely coincided with Prussia and Italy's aims. When the war was declared on June 20, 1866, the Kingdom of Italy could deploy some 220,000 regular troops, plus some 38,000 volunteers of the so-called Corpo Volontari Italiani under General Giuseppe Garibaldi, operating from northeastern Lombardy toward the Adige Valley. The Italian 20 regular divisions were banded in two bodies, an Armata del Mincio army, on 12 infantry division plus 1 cavalry, led by King Victor Emmanuel II and by General Alfonso La Marmora, who had relinquished the premiership to Baron Bettino di Casoli on the same day of the war declaration. Moreover, the other 8 divisions were included into an Armata del Po, army of the Po River, under General Enrico Cialdini. The Austrian forces, the Southern Imperial Army under Archduke Albrecht von Habsburg-Teschen, amounted formally to some 190,000 troops, but the field army was far smaller, more or less 61,000 troops, plus more or less 10,000, 11,000 troops as an hastily arranged strategic reserve. The pivot of the Austrian maneuver was the so-called quadrilateral fortress system. It means the fortress of Peschiera on the Garda Lake, Mantua, Legnago, and Verona, between the Mincio, the Po, and the Adige River. In the early days of the war, La Marmora's effort to force the quadrilateral possibly conceived more as a large, let's say, promenade militaire than a really aggressive maneuver, proved unsuccessful, leading to the well-known defeat of Custozza on June 24. In Custozza, the Austrian victory was not decisive. However, together with Admiral Carlo Pellion di Persano, highly dramatized defeat in Lissa on July 20 of the same year, it soon became one of the symbols of the limit, of the operational limit of Italian armed forces. The Prussian victory inside of Königgrätz on July 3rd and the following Nikolsburg armistice on July 26 ended the operation of the Northern Front and allowed Austria to divert at least part of its troops toward the Italian theater, thus forcing the diplomatic end of the conflict. On August 12, the Austrian and Italian delegates signed the Common Armistice, providing the Italian withdrawal behind the old border of the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia and the evacuation of Trentino and part of the county of Gorizia that Italy had occupied. The Treaty of Vienna ratified the agreement. Austria lost Veneto, lost the province of Mantua, lost the western part of Friuli. All this territory was ceded to France and then from France to Italy after a formal plebiscite held on October 21st, 22nd. On the other hand, Trentino and the eastern Friuli, I mean the princely county of Gorizia and Gradisca, remained under Habsburg sovereignty. From the Italian perspective, the agreement was or proved quite frustrating. The involvement of France as, let's say, middleman was largely perceived as humiliating. Equally resented was the loss of the Italian-speaking part of Trentino that Italian troops had occupied during the war. And this loss of Trentino was somehow blamed in some political circle to the Prussian promise embodied in Article 1 of the Nicholasburg Armistice, and I'm quoting, "With the exception of Lombardo-Venetian Kingdom, the territory of the Austrian monarchy remained intact." End of quotation. The impact of the war was momentous. Admiral Persano was judged by the Italian Senate, underwent a trial in front of the Italian Senate. He was condemned and was cashiered from duty. However, for the land campaign, the effort to define responsibility was far more elusive, mainly due to the involvement of the king, of course. Custoza was an encounter battle, and the outcome was a product of manufacture. Poor reconnaissance, no actual battle plan, operational difficulties, misunderstandings, so on and so forth, the lack of coordination, and a good deal of personal rivalry between La Marmora and Cialdini, the two main commanders. La Marmora loss of temper after the withdrawal of the first two divisions of the Italian army engaged in the battle. All these factors conjured in transforming a manageable defeat into a large-scale retreat. Finally, the paralysis of Italian initiative following the Custoza defeat triggered a sort of diplomatic crisis with Prussia, which deeply resented, let's say, what it considered the Ally weak fighting spirit. The later military success of the campaign did not change the attitude of the public opinion and of who in the country elite asked for a radical change in the Risorgimento trajectory. Custoza and Lissa marked the end of the heroic might of Italian unification. On the other hand, they highlighted the objective limit of the old Piedmontese military establishment that produced General La Marmora and a large part of a senior officer who led the Italian troop on the field. This led to the beginning of a lively debate about the possibility to modernize the Italian army structure, moving away from the existing semi-professional structure based on the so-called Ordinamento Fanti of 1861, and to move toward a model more inspired move toward an army more inspired to the Prussian model. Between January and March 1866, a technical committee appointed by the Minister of War, General Efisio Cugia, elaborated the first reform project. Its guideline, and this guideline will be a constant of every effort to reform the Italian army during the 19th century, were the extension and expansion of the draft system, the reduction of the service period, and the will to limit the legal alternative to the military service. After a 3-year debate affected by recurrent parliamentary crises, often on military issue, the product was a so-called Ordinamento Ricotti, established in 1870-73. Trying to incorporate part of the lesson drawn from the Prussian experience, Ricotti based his reform on a short, between quotation mark, compulsory military service period of 3 years, 5 in the cavalry, fed by a nationwide universal draft system. In the long term, the aim was to create a large reserve force to replenish, in time of war, a framework structure of 10 army corps kept at a reducing strength in peacetime. Ricotti also envisaged the creation of a system of militia at different operational value. A mobile militia to support the field army in mobilization, and the territorial militia to perform second-line duties. Discharged regular personnel should have fed both of these militia, both the mobile and the territorial one. However, the need to respect the tight budgetary constraint imposed by Italy's dire economic and financial condition heavily impacted on the actual implementation of this system. Moreover, some important aspect of the Ordinamento Ricotti contributed to distance it from the original Prussian model. The nationwide draft system, for example, negatively impacted on unit cohesion. Prussian draft was an regional system. While, again, in Italy, the frequent rotation of the units among different regions, more or less every 4 years, a regiment was shifted from one region to another, and the frequent use in resented public order duties widened the existing gap between the army and the society. And this is another important departing from the Prussian model. After the decline of the destra storica, of the so-called destra storica, the liberal conservative elite that proceeded over the Risorgimento process and ruled the king in the first decade of its life, the effort to reshape Italy's military instrument gained further momentum. Since 1875, with the adoption of the so-called Ordinamento Mezzacapo, Ricotti system was gradually envisaged. The Ordinamento Mezzacapo had a very important feature. It was the first Italian military ordinamento, the first set of Italian military laws, stating the principle that the military service was a citizen duty. And the consequences of this shift in the ideological approach would have been important in the following year. The budgetary constraints remain, of course, and impacted on the reform implementation, but something else really changed. At both political and technical level, the international situation, the international context gained new room in military planning. And this was an important shift in the traditional Italian military politics. Equally, the effort to keep the Italian standard up to the level of the other European power, both in terms of personnel and equipment, gained a renewed attention. The entry into the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary on May 20, 1882, made the army strength an increasingly critical factor. At the same time, the vision of its role, the vision of the function of the Italian army gradually shifted from defense, as it had been during the period of the destra storica, to offense. And this was another element that made the military elite more resentful of a parliamentary tug of war and allowed the military elite to be frequently successful in its quest for greater military budget. All this guideline inspired all the reform carried out between 1880 and the late 1890s. I have no time to enter into the detail. I try to offer a better vision, thank you, in the final paper. However, this guideline paved the way to large-scale changes started in 1909 and embodied in the final Ordinamento Pollio-Spingardi that led Italy to the First World War. And a pivotal figure in this process was General Alberto Pollio. General Alberto Pollio was chief of the army staff in 1908-1914 and was one of the most prominent figures of what I labeled the Italian-Prussian school. Pollio was military attaché to the Italian embassy in Vienna, was strongly pro-German, maybe not as much pro-German as some portrait tried to picture him, but, well, it was quite favorable to the Italian participation in the Triple Alliance. As a chief of staff, he promoted the modernization of the army at technical and doctrinal level, committed the country to actively cooperate with the Central Empire in case of a European conflict. With the active support of Minister for War General Paolo Spingardi, during Pollio's tenure, the military ordinary and extraordinary expedition grew from 365 million lira to 694. It more than doubled. 145 million was devoted to the renewal of artillery park, just to say the extent of the effort that Pollio carried out, 25 million to light weapon, and in the same period the personnel grew from 2,500 to 2,500 people. Unsurprisingly, Pollio devoted a special attention to the Custozza experience. When he wrote his book on Custozza 1866, it was in 1903, it was published in Turin, the battle had already been widely studied, also trying to apply the Prussian experience to the event of the battle. Back in 1866, the Rivista Militare Italiana published the first relation on the battle, and in 1875-95, it was published the official history from the Army Historical Branch. It was published in 1875, but had been drafted in 1867-68, so soon after the battle. However, in the cultural milieu of the late 19th, early 20th century, Pollio's approach had a peculiar value. In emphasizing the reason for the defeat, it blamed it on the lack of a unified command, on the contrast between La Marmora and Cialdini, and more generally, once again, to the limit of the Piedmontese military establishment, remarking how, and I'm quoting, due to the immense improvement that the Italian army had made since that time, we will do no more many of those tactical hector. However, Pollio criticized what is so the high command lack of resolution, negatively comparing to this attitude, and negatively comparing this attitude to the firmness he prized as a primary military value. Pollio, in receiving the Prussian lesson, let's say, not only focused on the technical and organizational dimension, but quite clearly on the moral dimension. And this was, from many points of view, and once again, another important departure for the traditional Italian military vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianluca, also for sticking to the time. Now I would like to open the debate. And are there any questions? Yes, each one of you get a number. First, Michael. Second, over there. Third, fourth. Great. Okay, we've got 4 questions. First, you pose your question, Michael, and then the speakers will answer.
Thank you very much, Michael Sansky, Military Academy in Zurich. Well, Peter, congrats for chairing this panel. You did well, I must say. And then I have a question for Dr. Medwiecki. Thank you very much for this exceptional talk about this Hungarian Czechoslovakian border war. I think it's in international military historiography a quite overseen topic when it comes to post-World War I history. And thank you for keeping old nationalist narratives out of your presentation. That was very refreshing. Thank you. My question is, this border war took place in a very populated area. And we saw pictures of proper soldier columns and parades and everything. But in a war where thousands of people die and get wounded, I'd like to know what is about refugee columns, what is about, I mean, they were fighting over populated areas. Were there attempts of ethnic cleansing or rebellion or removal of population groups? How was the civil population affected in this conflict? Thank you.
Well, Michael, thank you for your question, and thank you for your remarks. I very much appreciate it. And regarding the civilian population, well, basically, there were not really acts of ethnic cleansing, as far as I know. Since, especially in my personal opinion, since the Hungarians tried to hold the country together, they really had no intention to, you know, push the Slovakian citizens, Slovakian national away somewhere, because there was no reason. And from the Czechoslovak side, it would make a very bad impression on the people. You have to think of that the peace conference was still going on. So starting a large-scale, let's say, repression of the civilian population wouldn't very much help the Czechoslovak cause in Paris. And our representatives in Paris were very keen on keeping a good image there, of course. So I wouldn't say maybe there were some minor incidents, but it was not common such as it was common in other occasions or in other areas.
Thank you very much. Number 2 here, please. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, with a blue jacket. Yeah, 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 sir.
Mr. Diaz, Turkey. Just short remark to Dr. Borsani. During one of my research, I come across reports from an American military observer posted to Fiume. President Woodrow Wilson, tried to uncover problems in Europe by sending fact-finding missions or some military observers. And this guy, Major Charles Wellington Furlong, was a special aide to President Wilson So President Wilson sent this guy on the ground, and this guy provided a direct communication line to the president, provided daily updates, collected the views of the locals, and his ideas and his letters influenced the Wilson's approach to the Fiume crisis, and generally military observers not seen very much in the literature, but this guy played an important role. Thank you.
Just to be brief, thank you for your question. I would say that President Wilson was mainly influenced by the so-called inquiry. It was a group of experts that he brought to Paris. These more than military observers, I would say, yeah, they collected information on the ground and were absolutely useful. I mean, during the conference, reports from different delegations were contested by the counterparts on the base on how they were collected, what the data said, and so on and so forth. That's true also for Italy, for instance, in the Adriatic. I mean, I would say that Wilson, I would stress that Wilson was, I would say, an academic president. I mean, he tried to study in theory problems without a lot of roots on the ground. I mean, data collected were important, but the American line at the peace conference was led mainly by theoretical ideas, theoretical constructions, and the principle of self-determination with its contradictions, because it had a lot of contradiction, mainly also on Italy, not mainly, also on Italy in Trentino and in the Adriatic, for instance, where they were quite interesting from the academic perspective. I hope I answered.
Well, this guy was not part of the inquiry. This was military intelligence officer.
Yeah, they collected data on the ground, and they were absolutely useful. I mean, but the American line was mainly led, in my opinion, by the so-called inquiry, the group of experts.
Okay, good, thank you. Next one here, number 3, number 4.
Oui, ma question s'adresse au professeur Pastori. J'ai beaucoup apprécié votre communication et ce que je voudrais savoir, c'est est-ce que l'Italie a pu profiter sur le plan militaire en matière de formation d'après les sources que j'ai pu consulter pour, par exemple, servir et profiter lors de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale à Mussolini. Et je voudrais savoir, en termes disons, de fantassins, donc parce que c'est l'armement de l'infanterie qui a beaucoup profité à Mussolini. Est-ce que également, où s'arrête exactement la troisième guerre d'indépendance? Parce que l'Italie en a connu. Donc, jusqu'à quelle limite on peut considérer que la guerre d'indépendance sur le plan proprement militaire et technique s'achève? Et ça, c'est quand même des questions que les historiens ont débattues sans pouvoir exactement limiter les frontières. Où s'arrête la troisième guerre d'indépendance? Merci.
Thank you, Professor, for your stimulating question. Regarding the impact of the Prussian experience on the Second World War, I would say it was quite negligible. After the after the death of General Pollio, there was a radical change in the Italian vision of the conflict. famous red book by General Cadorna on the assault strategy used during the First World War was sometime an effort to turn back the time, to return to a pre-polio strategic model. And in the coming year, Cadorna impact was, in my opinion at least, far more important than polio once. As far as your question about what is a war of independence, why I called it Italo-Austrian War of 1866 as the third war of Italian independence. Well, on the one hand, it's sort of homage to a traditional way of calling this conflict. On the other hand, the so-called Third War of Independence was explicitly presented as an effort to return Italian territories, sorry, to return Italian territories to Italy, the Venetia, the Trentino, etc., the Friuli, and so on. From an ideological point of view, even the First World War, as Davide Borsani said, was presented as a sort of fourth war of independence, once again to recover Italian-speaking territories to Italy. Yeah, of course, we can spend a lot of time to understand was really liberation, was really, let's say, restitution to Italy of traditional Italian territories. Okay. I think everybody can find his own answer to this question. What I think is important is how the question was perceived at the time. I think one of the great risks of doing history is doing history with our category and applying our category to totally different mindsets. I don't know if I replied to your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please, sir. Yeah, it's you. Question.
Good afternoon, Jose Romero from Spain, Spanish Commission. And my question goes for Professor Pastori as well. I am curious to know this change of doctrine from defensive to offensive, how impacted on the Italian military structure, organization. And I tell you that because I have very clearly in mind the Spanish example. So I would like to know your answer or your point on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will devote some room in the final presentation to how this change in the final text on how this change of mindset affected the military structure. The most important aspect from my point of view is that in more or less 1876, the mindset changed. The army was no more, the aim of the army was no more to protect the Italian territory, but was to recover the missing part of the territory and at a certain point in time to project Italian influence outside. This led, first of all, to an increase in the number, and second point, to a change in the structure, with greater attention, for example, to artillery, with greater attention to modern equipment, with greater attention, but this is another topic, on the role of Navy, and so on and so forth. As I said, I don't have enough time to present how this situation changed during the year. I'll do it in the final paper, and I hope maybe next year to have a dialogue with you on this aspect.
Okay, thank you. And now Massimo, you have raised your hand.
Thank you very much, Massimo Leonardo from Italy. My question is addressed to my Slovak colleague. You mentioned Czechoslovak units, military units, and you mentioned Slovak units. So it means, of course, Slovak units were made by Slovaks, but Czechoslovak units were made mainly by Czechs or also by Slovaks, and how this fits in the context of national rivalries between the two ethnic groups. Because as far as I understand, in the original program, the name of the new state had to be Czechoslovakia, and then became Czechoslovakia. It's the same situation we had in the 90s. So how the Slovaks, and particularly the military Slovaks, accepted that the new state was a kind of centralized state under the hegemony of the Czech. Just one remark. I always skeptical about idealistic politicians. In my opinion, Wilson was more naive than idealistic when he says that the borders between Italy and Yugoslavia can be easily recognized, well, easily. And just a short comment to Borsani, Dr. Borsani, excellent. You mentioned that Italy was, Austria, you said, was the controversial ally in the Triple Alliance. Well, it's a very Italian point of view. Well, according to the general opinion, Italy was the controversial ally.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your question and for your remarks. I really appreciate it, and you are completely right. Yeah, it's not an easy situation, but at first there were this Slovak unit from Lučenec, and the other one I mentioned was a volunteer unit made on this base, and Czechoslovakia, of course, at first was Czechoslovakia, and only after the adoption of the constitution became Czechoslovakia. And in fact, the problem you mentioned was a constant in Czechoslovak army, especially Slovak officers, especially during the interwar period, or many Slovak officers in the interwar period felt like they have less chances for the career advance in the Czechoslovak army than their Czech colleagues had, and felt like a minor brothers. And what is interesting, it changed, especially in the 70s, 1970s, when there was a rule that at least 1/3 of the officer corps should be Slovak, and the President Gustav Husak, a Slovak from a village near Bratislava, today part of Bratislava, made effort and put many Slovaks, to interesting positions. And then there was, let's say, on the Czech side, there was let's say, a bit of negative emotions towards that we have too many Slovaks here in Prague now, and so on. So, the situation developed somehow.
Okay. Are there any other questions? We have got still 7 minutes left. Yes, please, over there.
Yes, to pursue that line of questioning just a little bit further, you mentioned that some of the units, I thought I heard you mention that some of the units also included Poles. Is that correct?
Boli tam aj nejaké poľské, to som si fakt neistý. No, they didn't. Sorry, I was not really sure.
Okay, well, yeah, because I was thinking that there was some blending of those different ethnic groups on the northern border, and that included also the so-called Ruthenians, and I was just curious as to whether they played any role in these units?
No, as far as know, they didn't. And at the time, we also had some, let's say, minor disagreement with Poland over some border territories, especially in northern Moravia. And there were exchanges, or there were some border corrections in 1920, I think 1924, and another one, I don't remember the exact date. Thank you for your question.
Toujours professeur Babana de la Commission marocaine d'histoire militaire. Toujours ma question s'adresse également au professeur Pastori parce qu'il nous apporte beaucoup d'éléments très intéressants. Et je voudrais savoir, pendant la période de la guerre d'indépendance, troisième guerre d'indépendance, particulièrement de l'Italie, contre donc les forces prussiennes, qu'est-ce que l'Italie a pu, par exemple, connaître, découvrir, savoir et s'imprégner sur le plan culturel de la Prusse, parce que quand même la période est assez longue et la durée, la Prusse, comme vous le savez, c'est depuis 1701 jusqu'à 1871, n'est-ce pas? Et je pense qu'elle a été intégrée, je crois, à la fin de la Première Guerre mondiale, n'est-ce pas, en 1918. Donc cette longue période de presque 2 siècles, je crois qu'elle a dû quand même inspirer et influencer sur le plan culturel, socio-culturel, l'Italie. Quel est l'aspect le plus important dans cette influence culturelle prusse sur l'Italie? Merci.
Thank you, Professor. I would point out at least 2 aspects. One is more, let's say, it's more related to the military dimension. The other one, more on the, let's say, socio-political dimension. On the first one, on the first side, the meeting with the Prussian experience led to the rediscovery of the idea of the so-called Nation Army. The Italian army, the Royal Italian Army, had a strong tradition of being a royal army. A relatively small, quite professional army with an officer corps quite intimately related to the king and belonging to quite a closed circle. Meeting with the Prussian experience, Italian military writers started recovering the idea of a Nation Army. The army must be popular from a certain point of view. Of course, I'm not talking about a democratic army and so on and so forth, but had to be popular. When I said that Ordinamento Mezzocapo established the principle that every citizen has the duty to defend the country, this is, ideologically speaking, an enormous departure from tradition. On another side, I would point out the influence of a, let's say, conservative mindset. And it's quite strange because the political faction that was most affected by this, let's say, conservative revival was the so-called sinistra storica, the historical left. And it's quite strange that a political group branding himself as left adopt a conservative political model. The most striking example was Prime Minister Francesco Crispi. Francesco Crispi was a strong admirer of the Prussian model, was a strong admirer of Chancellor Bismarck. But Crispi himself came from a Garibaldian background. He was a Garibaldi man in Sicily at that time. And this adoption of conservatism as a basic frame of reference of Italian politics is, in my opinion, another important
elements of the impact with the Prussian experience.
Okay, thank you. I would like to close the panel now, but not without thanking again the speakers for the great time management, and also for the audience for the time management and for the precise questions. I think we are faring much better than with punctuality than German railway services today. Okay, thank you.